All right, what is going on with Iran? Are we maneuvering towards war or are we taking steps back? Well, with us tonight is Trita Parsi, Executive VP of the Quincy Institute and author of several books on the U.S., Iran, Israel triangle, including Losing an Enemy, Obama, Iran, and the Triumph of Diplomacy, as well as Treacherous Alliance. The book Scott Horton last week on this show said was the best foreign policy book he's ever read. Trita Parsi was born in Iran, raised in Sweden. He has spent his career diving deep into the complicated and often secretive relationships between Iran, Israel, and the United States. We're going to talk about whether or not we're heading to war with Iran, at the behest of Israel, of course, or could President Trump negotiate a new nuclear deal, and what exactly would that deal look like? Also, we're going to ask him about whether or not Israel and Iran are actually secretly cooperating behind the scenes, each pretending to want war, while in actuality benefiting politically from the constant tension. Trita, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, let's talk about Iran and where we're at with this. I mean, it just feels like each day we're getting, it feels like we get closer to war and then we suddenly are not. You know, we seem to be just like this week alone feeling, okay, we're targeting Iran. And then the next thing we know, Trump does a deal with the Houthis, and that blindsides Israel. And that seems to be sort of, taking a step back from potential aggressions with Iran. I mean, what are you making of this administration? What is Trump's goal, do you think? And do you think we're going to end up at war with Iran?
So I think Trump's goal actually is quite clear. What is not clear is whether he has a strategy to get to his goal. His goal is a deal with Iran. I'm profoundly convinced that he's really looking for a deal. I think actually he was looking for a deal during his first term as well. I think I misjudged him a little bit on that. But he was sold a very, very problematic strategy designed to make sure that he didn't get a deal, and he fell for it. And this is part of the reason why he has not included the Boltons, the Pompeos, the Brian Hooks, and many of those people into his current administration. If you listen carefully to his messaging on this during the campaign, it was very disciplined. He wants a deal. His only red line is nuclear weapons, and he has no interest in regime change. And he kept on repeating that. He was not spending a lot of time bragging about killing Soleimani or talking bad about the previous nuclear deal. I mean, I'm sure he said it on a couple of occasions. But what he kept on going back to, I want a deal. The only red line I have is no nuclear weapons. That formula is totally doable. That's actually what the JCPOA was as well. A deal that prevented them from getting nuclear weapon, but enabled them to continue to have a civilian nuclear program with reprocessing capacities. Getting to it, however, is challenging because at the end of the day, there's a lot of technical issues, and you still have a scenario in which some people in the administration, as well as several of the countries that Trump otherwise is relatively close to, are doing everything they can to prevent him from getting a deal and pushing him towards a military confrontation.
Right. So when it comes to a deal, getting to a deal, what was the problem with the original deal that you think Trump is going to solve in this attempt at getting a deal with Iran?
Personally, I don't believe that there was a major problem with the deal. I think from Trump's perspective, there is a problem that he was very upset about, but it's not the one that the foreign policy establishment is upset about. There were elements in the foreign policy establishment that wanted a longer restrictions and things of that nature. That was not Trump's problem. Trump's problem was that the original deal only lifted secondary sanctions, which meant that it enabled European, Chinese, Russian companies to go into the Iranian market. But it didn't touch primary sanctions. Those are the sanctions that target American companies. So it was a deal that had a lot of positive economic benefits for all of America's competitors. But American companies could still not get into the Iranian market. The deal that they're looking at now very much seems to be about also lifting primary sanctions, which for the first time the Iranians have said that that they're welcoming, they want to see American investments. And this is what I think Trump will use to be able to say, hey, this is a better deal. He probably will try to get something on the nuclear side of it as well to just protect himself. But when it comes to selling it to the rest of the country, how many Americans know what centrifuges are?
Right.
What do they know about LEU? It doesn't mean anything. Job creation, opening new markets. investments. Those are the things that they understand, and that's where he's also much more comfortable. So that aspect, I think he can improve on the deal. I think it would have been better if the original deal actually had this, because if you have this, that also means that you will have a strong political constituency in the United States that is eager to sustain the deal. Because if they moved into that market, they don't want to get kicked out again by sanctions. It's not impossible that the US would reimpose sanctions, but it is less likely and more difficult. This is then also attractive to the Iranian side, who don't want to have a deal with the US that actually is only a deal with the US president. And as soon as he or she leaves office, who knows what's going to happen. I mean, this has become a problem for the US in making deals with a whole set of different countries, that we're just not reliable any longer. But making sure that the deal has strong constituents in several different places, and the business community would be one of the strongest ones, would be a significant benefit for their longevity of the deal. And obviously for the American economy, it's certainly not a bad thing.
You think the Iranians would go for that? I mean, I understand the point of it brings stability, because you're right, American companies that go back into Iran would not want to get kicked out of Iran this time around. So I understand that logic completely. But at the same time, with Americans coming into the country, there could be opportunity for, bad actors that are pretending to be, guys there for oil, and really they're there to topple the regime. So that would be something I would think the Iranians would be a little bit nervous about.
And Kim, you're absolutely right. This is part of the reason why the Iranians didn't push for this in 2014, 2015. Also, Obama wasn't ready to do it, but nevertheless, the Iranians were not really looking for it, because the red line for the Iranian hardliners was not a nuclear deal. They could live with that. What they couldn't live with is America re-entering Iran, establishing what the buzzword at the time became, which is nufuz in Persian, which means influence. Because American presence would bring about American influence. And in the long run, their calculation, probably quite correctly, is that American influence would be to the detriment of Iran's hardliners' grip on power. Now, this has now changed, and it has changed for a variety of reasons. The Supreme Leader himself has now endorsed the idea of limited American investments in the Iranian industrial sector. I think they're sensitive about consumer goods. Things that the consumer gets to see. They would not like to see a bunch of Starbucks and McDonald's in the street corners of Iran. But things that go from business to business and is kind of shielded away from the consumers, they're more comfortable with. But also, they don't want the US to enter or become very important in strategic areas. So for instance, even though the Iranians import a lot of agricultural products as well as corn, wheat, etc., I'm not entirely sure how open they would be to giving the US a big share of that market, in the sense that they're worried that that would provide leverage, or that, in the future, if the US leaves the deal, the Iranians would be in a dire situation because their food product or their import of food would suddenly come at risk. But there is a dramatic shift in Iran on this issue. And it was really manifested with the op-ed that the Iranian foreign minister put in Washington Post, in which he said, it is not Iran that stands in the way of American companies taking advantage of what he called a $1 trillion opportunity in Iran. Whether that's $1 trillion or not is a different story. But nevertheless, he was essentially saying it's not Iran preventing them from coming in, it's US sanctions.
Yeah. What types of industries back when prior to the revolution? What type of industries were Americans involved in Iran? I mean, I know oil. My family lived over there. In fact, after they left Vietnam, they were over there and had to leave at the fall at the revolution. Had to get out, and there had to be actually kind of an act of Congress to help get my family out. Senator Frank Church had to help. Yeah. Well, I had a cousin that was born there. And even though she wasn't Iranian by blood, she was born there, and they were like, "Well, she's ours." And then, so it literally had to take an act of Congress to get her out after the revolution. Yeah. But so I know that oil was a big one. So I mean, would an oil company? I mean, that seems to be highly influential. If you can get oil companies back in there, that would be.
Yes. And the oil companies, I'm sure, would be more than happy to. In fact, when the Iranians first reopened their economy after the revolution in 1992, they began negotiations with ConocoPhillips, and they struck a deal with them. And Conoco was about to go in and take over one of the biggest oil fields in Iran. to develop it. And then Congress and the pro-Israel lobby intervened, and they got Clinton to issue 2 executive orders that not only killed that deal, but also killed the entire trade between Iran and the US, which at the time was at $4 billion. So oil, I'm sure, would be quick to go back in, but there's many other industries as well that could benefit from this. And again, at the end of the day, if he wants to say he got a better deal, this is an easy way for him to make a convincing case to the American public that it is.
All he has to do is change one little thing for him to say that.
Yeah.
That's how Trump works. Just some tiny little thing, and it works for him because otherwise I think if he was talked into a bad decision the first term, and now he realizes that, you can't just say, well, we're just going to go right back into the same exact deal. I mean, you have to make one tiny change at least, right, in order to save face.
The Iranians don't want the same deal either. I mean, things have changed a lot on both sides, and the Iranians learned that the previous deal had a lot of mechanisms to make sure that the Iranians wouldn't cheat and that they wouldn't leave. So, for instance, the snapback sanctions is a mechanism that was put in place in case the Iranians would cheat. The deal had no mechanisms of what would happen in case the US were to leave the deal. I mean, that scenario was not even really envisioned by either side. And it turns out that was the scenario that actually occurred.
Yeah.
So there's going to be a lot of changes from demands from their end as well. But there is also a reality we have to take into account. In many different ways, the deal is going to have some similarities with the previous deal for a very simple reason. The laws of physics have not changed just because the president changed. When you produce fuel rods for nuclear reactors for civilian use, you need to enrich uranium up to 3.67%. That hasn't changed, and it's not going to change for a very long time, if it ever. So some elements of this is going to be the same as what was before. And the question is, how sensitive is Trump going to be to those type of accusations? It appears right now that it is a sensitive point for him. Whether it ultimately will be one or not remains to be seen.
Now, what about the Israelis in all of this?
Well, the Israelis have done everything they can since the mid-1990s to prevent the US and Iran from even talking to each other, let alone striking a deal. And the Israelis completely miscalculated. They thought that Trump would allow them to go to war with Iran and support them full out. Now, he clearly has done that in Gaza. But that was also, we have to be fair, a continuation of what Biden already had put in place. Trump has made it worse in many different ways, but it's not a change in trajectory. It's an intensification and an acceleration of an existing policy. But on Iran, clearly, he's shown that this is he wants to go in a different direction. I mean, it's quite stunning. He summoned Netanyahu to the White House, didn't even tell him what the topic was, and didn't even tell him until he was in front of the cameras in the Oval Office that just 5 days later, the US and Iran were going to have a meeting together. And you could see Netanyahu just being completely stunned. Mm-hmm. And then you had the decision just a couple of days ago in which he strikes a deal with the Houthis that only stops the Houthis attacking US, doesn't stop the Houthis from attacking Israel. He was even asked about it. What if the Houthis continue to attack Israel? He says, I don't care about that. So he has shown a remarkable, almost unprecedented willingness to say no to the Israelis compared to previous American presidents. And on something that he decides is important to him, which Iran is, but Gaza is not, unfortunately, he's shown the willingness to use his leverage and treat the Israelis in a way that they are absolutely not used to being treated by, particularly American Republican presidents.
Yeah. I just think Trump is more of a realist when it comes to Gaza and to the Palestine issue in general, as much as I don't like the realism of the situation. I mean, Israel's just been pummeling the place forever, and it's just been a slow decline for Palestine. I mean, they're losing. They're not, and I don't see an outcome where they win. I think the Israelis are just hell-bent on ensuring they take all of the land. And I think that's, for a lot of people, the writing's on the wall, including for a lot of Palestinians who've left and who've decided to just go make their lives somewhere else, as they've just thought, as much as they would love to fight and stick around and gain the land and have a two-state solution or something, it just, it's a pretty dismal situation. Of course, the U.S. is helping with that, but I think even
the Israelis could not do this without the U.S. They don't even have the weaponry and the ammunition to be able to sustain a war this long. This is all because of the tremendous amount of support that Biden first, and now Trump has continued to give them.
Yeah.
They've lost territory in the past. I'm personally not of the view that the Palestinians are going to give up their claim to their land. I think that their struggle is just going to be manifested in different ways. I think you're right that that is how Trump looks at it. He says, hey, they lost, so this is just a reality. They will have to just swallow their pride and accept this. I think that would nevertheless be a mistake, particularly mindful of some of the ideas that we're hearing being floated that the U.S. would enter in as peacekeepers or actually managing the occupation. That's just a complete
What a
throwback
disaster.
to the Iraq years. It would be a complete disaster. But even short of that, I think this would lead to something that would constantly suck the US back into the region. And that's exactly what Trump doesn't want. So when it comes to the realism of it, I think if he's really a realist, he puts US interests first. And that's where the analysis begins. And that analysis does not lead to a scenario in which this type of direction for the Israelis ultimately is good for the US, in my view.
Yeah. Yeah. What do you think about Mike Waltz? So he just got ousted out as the national security advisor, but he didn't get fully ousted. I mean, it looked like the guy was a total traitor. He had downloaded an Israeli version of the Signal app, like a special version of the app that allowed the content to be saved and even shared. And yet he gets moved over to UN ambassador, which is, why is he not being looked at as a traitor? Why are any of these people in Congress that are operating like this, which seems to be double agents, why are they not being viewed as traitors of the country and actually investigated and prosecuted? I mean, this is just outrageous.
Well, you saw one quote from one unnamed Trump official that was very hard hitting. He said, when you're the national security advisor, you serve the US president, not the president or prime minister of another country. So perhaps not putting it as harshly as you did, but nevertheless saying pretty much the same thing. Yeah. And this is apparently what happened. And he was coordinated. And what is really striking to me is that he did the same thing as Pompeo and Bolton had done. That was a key reason as to why they ended up being on Trump's bad side. And the guy just repeats the same thing and is caught within just weeks of having done this. So I personally think it's very good news because he was the lead neoconservative in the Trump 2 administration. A lot of the people that are currently in the NSC are there because of him. We don't know whether it will be a larger cleanup and making sure that there's more people that are actually in line with what Trump says that he wants to do and the promises he made about, ending endless wars, getting out of these conflicts, mediating peace in different places. A lot of the challenges he had in the first administration was that he had folks that were not on the same page with him. In some ways, that could have been good, of course, in specific examples. But in many different examples, it actually led to a scenario in which you had his envoy to Syria bragging about it publicly afterwards, that he did everything he could to make sure that Trump's order to withdraw from Syria never actually was implemented.
Yeah.
And I think he's been adamant about making sure that he runs a tighter ship this time around. And Waltz was the huge exception, which kind of like negated the belief that he actually was serious about making sure that he had an administration that was in line with him. So there's an opportunity now to fix it. We're not necessarily there quite yet. But I think that's going to be absolutely crucial because he cannot afford, if he wants to withdraw from Iraq, if he wants to withdraw from Syria, to have not just the broader bureaucracy resist, and there's a natural tendency oftentimes because of inertia to resist, but to actually have his own National Security Council resist.
The Israelis just must be reeling. I mean, this is just, again, it feels like, oh, we're headed to war. There seems to be posturing, and then suddenly changes are made that make us think, well, okay, or maybe we're not going to war, I guess. And this is totally against what the Israelis would have preferred. And this is another one of those.
And I think you're seeing a level of desperation among some of the organizations that are very close or aligned with Israelis on this issue, in which they're kind of seeing that on a lot of these different issues, they're losing the plot. They're still fighting tooth and nail, however. They're not giving up. And the question is, how far will they go in directly opposing Trump? They could do that with Obama. They could do that with Biden. I have a hard time seeing them being able to do it with Trump without paying a very heavy cost. I mean, look, there's been a massive campaign against Witkoff, his envoy, on several different mediations, as well as against Qatar and Oman, two of the countries that are helping with the mediation. The campaign against Witkoff started in Channel 12 or 14 in Israel, which is very close to the Netanyahu administration. And I personally been a little bit surprised about how openly it is an Israeli operation to get Witkoff fired, and how much it seems to have, at this point at least, kind of been tolerated by Trump. It's a bit surprising to me, to be frank, but I cannot see that being sustained without there being some sort of a severe pushback at some point.
Do you think the Israelis really want war with Iran? Because it does seem like they're pushing towards that, and they continue to push toward that. But war, I mean, the U.S. could say, all right, fine, you want to go to war with Iran, but you're on your own. I mean, you're going to have to fight it. You know, we'll pretend we're going to be there and give you some support, but we'll do it like we do for Ukraine. It won't be us actually dying on the battlefield. It'll have to be you. And you guys are already fighting the Palestinians. You're fighting the Houthis. You're fighting Hezbollah. You know, you're fighting all these other places. So there's been some Iranian, sources that I have that claim that this is all a ruse, that really Israel and Iran pretend like they're always going to go to war. They're always posturing about it. It always feels like we're on the brink. But in the end, neither of them actually want it. And they're maybe even secretly working together. I don't know if friends would be the right word, but they're secretly using this posturing in order to build up their own personal interests on the inside. So like Iran gets to use this and posture against Israel to keep the regime in power. And to say, it's an existential threat, we have to remain in power. And Israel kind of does the same thing in order to beef up their security state, in order to continue going after the Palestinians and those around them. And they get to use Iran all the time by saying Iran backed this, Iranian backed that, Iranian backed this. And so they're both using each other really to just achieve their goal. So they don't really want to go to war. And I brought this up actually when Scott Horton was on the show. And he said during the show that the best foreign policy book he has ever read is the one that you wrote, Treacherous Alliance, which kind of goes over a similar idea of how Israel and Iran and the United States coordinated or had. Well, why don't you tell us, what do you think about this idea that they don't really want to go to war, and kind of give us a little bit of the background of Treacherous Alliance?
Sure. Scott is being very kind. I appreciate that. There is an element of truth to what you were explaining, but it is not the countries. That's where I think it falls flat. There are elements inside of Iran and there are elements inside of Israel that view each other as mortal enemies, but have a common interest in either confrontation or at least being on a pathway towards confrontation. You're seeing how hardliners on both sides actually benefit from the other. That is different, however, from saying that behind the scenes everything is cool and they're just pretending and they're just using it. No, this is a function of various factions fighting with each other in the two different places, and getting the other side to do really horrific things helps the hardline elements of the other side. And so there's a symbiosis there. There's not necessarily a coordination, and certainly not some sort of a cabal in which they're actually on the same side. They're on the same side in terms that they actually want to have a confrontation with each other when it comes to those hardline elements. Now, it was different in the past, and what the book is about is the history of Iran and Israel's secret relationship. Because back in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and even the 1980s, the Iranians and the Israelis actually did have a secret relationship in which, at least up until the 1980s, there was a secret alliance between them, which actually wasn't terribly secret. It was just nevertheless never fully acknowledged by either side. And this came together because both of them at the time faced common security imperatives and geopolitical imperatives. The Israelis faced a hostile Arab world, and that hostile Arab world was largely supported by the Soviet Union. The Iranians had a long enmity with the Soviets, and of course also had a long enmity with particularly Arab nationalist states such as Egypt under Nasser, Iraq under Saddam Hussein. These geopolitical imperatives brought the two countries together, and they ended up collaborating extensively on intelligence, security, military, etc. But it was kept secret, mainly because of the Iranians. The Shah knew that if he made this open, he would actually attract a lot of Arab enmity and energy against Iran that otherwise would be focused on Israel. So he wanted to keep this secret, and he kept it secret, but it was an open secret. Most Arab states fully understood what was going on, but as long as it was kept secret, they could also get away with just focusing on the Israeli side of the equation. Now, 1979, you have a revolution in Iran. The Islamists take over, who have a very anti-Israel ideology, and saw Israel as a major power that was supporting the Shah staying in power, particularly mindful of the trainings that the Mossad provided to the Savak on how to do torture and things of that nature, and other intelligence sharing against Iranian opposition groups. But the geopolitical realities not only remained the same, in some ways they even intensified, because now the Iranians did not just have a common interest with Israel vis-a-vis Iraq, which invaded Iran, but also now the Iranians did not have the relationship with the US any longer because of the hostage crisis. And they needed some bridge to the US because their entire military was based on American weaponry, and they needed American spare parts, which the US refused to sell them any longer. From the Israeli side, the need for Iran grew also, because now if Iraq had won the war against Iran, Iraq would have had an almost dominant position in the Middle East, and it would be terrible for the Israelis. They feared what they called at the Eastern Front, their border with Jordan, would be at huge risk, because it would just take a couple of days for the Iraqi army to march through Jordan and position themselves not on the north of Israel, which is very narrow, or the south of Israel, but on this very, very long eastern border. So both of them had a common geopolitical imperative that actually intensified in the 1980s. And despite the very anti-Israel rhetoric and ideology of the Islamic Republic, they continued to deal with Israel behind the scenes. I'm sure you heard about the Iran-Contra scandal, but there's so much more than just that. And the Israelis were non-apologetic about it. Ariel Sharon was on American TV in 1982 on NBC saying, yes, we are selling weapons and spare parts to the Iranians in contradiction of America's sanctions and arms embargo in Iran, because we need to retain that relationship with Iran and make sure that they don't lose the war with Iraq. And the Israelis did a lot. I mean, in the 1980s, this is really fascinating. The country that was lobbying for Iran, lobbying for us to not pay attention to Iranian rhetoric, and lobbying the US to sell weapons to Iran was Israel. All of that then just dramatically changes in just a few years, very, very few, in 1991-92. Because then you had two major geopolitical shocks in the world. On the one hand, the Soviet Union collapsed. So on the global level, we were no longer in a bipolar world, but the US was the sole superpower of the world. And Iraq was defeated by the United States in a UN coalition after having invaded Kuwait. So the two common threats that had kept Iran and Israel as hidden friends, even despite of Iran's ideology, which was the threat from the Soviet Union, the threat from Iraq in particular, were now gone. And a completely different geopolitical environment emerged, in which Iran and Israel actually started emerging as two of the most powerful states. And the Israelis were the first one to kind of discover it and start talking about that the new threat was no longer the Arab vicinity, but the Persian periphery. And they started focusing on Iran, and they started in 1992 lobbying the United States to sanction Iran, to impose, to not talk to Iran, and just isolate the country, which is kind of shocking because that campaign was led by Yitzhak Rabin and Shimon Peres, who back in 1986 were the two key figures in Iran-Contra scandal and were trying to convince the United States to sell arms to the very same regime in Iran. Mm-hmm. And that geopolitical new configuration has continued and intensified, and is part of the reason why the Israelis are doing everything they can to make sure that there is no deal, there's no diplomacy, and the US goes to war with Iran. They need the US to essentially take down Iran a couple of notches in the region, to get the US to recommit to having a very strong military presence in the Middle East in order to provide an artificial balance of power in the region that benefits Israel, that Israel on its own cannot establish. Only the US can. The Israelis do not have a military option against Iran. That was made very clear just in the last couple of months in their communications with the Trump administration. Their so-called option on Iran is for the US to play a central role in the military operations, not just in the defense part of it. And in their own admission, it will only set Iran's program back a year, and after that year, the US needs to go and help Israel bomb Iran again. So they're not just selling war with Iran to Trump, they're selling endless war with Iran to Trump. And this is part of the reason why I think you've seen him push back.
Yeah.
This is not strongly supported within his current administration.
Right. Well, or in America. I don't think that any of us really want to go to war with Iran. Yeah. So just to be clear, because that is my big question, is what is Israel gaining? What would they gain from having a war with Iran? And you're saying that it's just they want to lessen their influence, but you're right, you can't do that unless you're going to be there continuously lessening. It's just like what they do to Gaza, the Palestinians, where they go in and they mow the lawn, every so often. So that's what they're saying we need to do.
As long as Israel was strong and Iran, Hezbollah was weak, Assad is not there, Israel's maneuverability in the region is far greater today than it was 2 years ago. Because they can do more or less what they want in most parts of Lebanon right now, as long as they don't go in with ground troops. Syria, take a look at the first thing that happened as soon as Assad fell. The Israelis just went in and bombed the hell out of every military depot. They didn't care about who comes in charge of Syria afterwards. They needed to make sure that Syria is completely weak, regardless of who is in charge. They don't care about who's in charge. What they care about is what are the capacities of Syria. If you have an Iran that either is strong, that either has strong relations with the West, or in worst case scenario has a nuclear weapon, that dramatically reduces Israel's maneuverability in the region. It's planned to expand its territory. It's now occupying an even larger chunk of Syria, larger than all of Gaza, which is now a buffer zone for the previous buffer zone which they occupy, which is the Golan Heights.
Right.
So from their standpoint, their standpoint is Israel can only survive if it dominates the region militarily. It cannot tolerate an Iran that is on good terms with the West, that is fully actualizing its own potential, which it hasn't, mainly because of the corruption and incompetence of this current regime. Those are nightmare scenarios. Look, also another thing. What happened after Assad fell? Suddenly you started seeing in Israeli media a lot of the focus on Iran shifting away from Iran as the big problem to guess who? Turkey. Why? Because Turkey is now ascendant. Even though they have relations with Turkey, even though Turkey is a NATO state, they cannot tolerate very, very strong countries that have the ability to infringe on the maneuverability that they want. The question we have to ask ourselves, what has this got to do with the US?
Right.
If that is an attitude that the Israelis want to adopt, and this is how they think that they will maximize their security, well, that's their prerogative to define it how they want, whether it's right or wrong. What has it got to do with us? This is the question that increasingly the Israelis are being asked, even by Republicans, and they cannot answer it. Yeah. Back in the 1990s, they said, we're fighting Iran for you because Iran is spreading Islamic fundamentalism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I think by now, 30 years later, a lot of Americans are not buying that any longer.
Yeah.
Take a look at what Marjorie Taylor Greene tweeted. I thought it was kind of funny on Yemen. She's emerged as a very strong opponent of further entanglement in Yemen. And she said, I've never met a Houthi in my life, nor has anyone in my district. So what is this thing about us going to war with the Houthis? My people in my district are dying from fentanyl and other things.
Yeah.
That's what we're concerned about. But these fantasy monsters that were constantly being sold by the foreign policy establishment, I'm paraphrasing what you say, I'm not buying it any longer.
Yeah.
And you're seeing that on the Republican as well as on the Democratic side. It's a very fascinating development.
Oh, well, you're frightening me with the Turkey thing, because then I'm sitting here thinking, so that would be the plan. So Israel would bait us into going to war with Iran, and let's say we do it. Let's say we're dumb enough, and we go and we decide, okay, I guess we're going to have a never-ending presence in the Middle East. We're going to bomb Iran every so often, mow the lawn, make sure that they don't have any military capabilities. And then what? We're going to do it to Turkey? Like they're next on the list? I thought there was only 7 countries. Now we're adding an 8th. I mean, this is
And you're so right. And this comes from the idea that your ability to establish your own security is by dominating and never allowing any country or combination of countries from having the capacity to pose a threat to you.
yeah,
This is not the security doctrine of any other state. Other states manage the threats, they establish deterrence and many other things. But complete domination puts you in a path towards endless war
yeah.
and endless conflict. Again, if you want to choose that for your country, your choice. You cannot choose that for our country.
Well, they're certainly trying. Trita Parsi, thank you so much for joining us and giving us your perspective on this. I feel a little better, actually, after hearing you. I think that maybe we're not headed to war with Iran. Maybe Trump will limit that. It seems like he's turning on the Israelis a little bit, and he's not giving them everything that they want. And that is a good thing, and I'm glad that you're pointing that out. So I feel better, I suppose, that I guess I feel better.
We haven't reached the final chapter of this book or even the final pages of the first chapter in this book. So
Yeah.
a lot can change. But if you were to compare it to what we faced just a couple of months ago, there is a capacity and willingness to say no to the Israelis. I did not experience that at all in the last 2 years of Biden.
Yeah.
And there is a president who made promises and who has a base that is very adamant about not going to war. Has nothing to do with larger geopolitical analysis. It's all about the perception that these are not real threats, and the real threats are at home, and these are distractions from the real issues that we're facing.
Yeah. Trita Parsi, thank you again for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for watching this clip from the full Kim Iversen Show, which you can check out Monday through Friday, 2 p.m. Pacific, 5 p.m. Eastern. The show airs live. It is a 1-hour live show Monday through Friday. Just head to KimIversonShow.com. See you there.